Um, the clock looks like the hands are perpendicular, so we're going to start. I was just in a math session here, so I'm kind of still exuding some of that stuff. Anyway, so I just want to thank you for coming. Just to introduce myself, I'm Albert Chang. I'm a professor at the University of Arkansas. I study education policy, and I'm part of the Department of Education Reform. So that's a slight plug if you're interested in getting a PhD in education policy. Come study with us because I do some classical education type research, and I'm going to actually show you some today. Okay, and so this is a project that I partnered with Sager Classical Academy in Siloam Springs to do. So I guess I should thank Jim, the dean of the upper school. I have that right? For kind of inviting me in and agreeing to let me and some other folks do stuff to their kids and study what some parts of the classical pedagogy does. Yeah, I'll explain what this stuff is. But as the title suggests, it has to do with poetry. So social science does poetry. Okay, and so I want to begin perhaps by laying down a proposition that Claire Basil was a student we tried to recruit, and she went off to do something else. But a couple years ago, she wrote a blog for the Fordham Institute, which is a DC education think tank. She was actually featuring the Great Hearts Charter School Academy in that piece. And give me a summary of what's the state of classical education during the pandemic. There's certainly a broader interest in it. And she had a section in there talking about the use of data. And so, a bit of my background, I'm a trained policy analyst, and so I do statistics and econometrics, work with big data, crunch numbers. And one of the points that Claire Basil was making was that, in the classical world, we've got great arguments philosophically, theoretically, for why we believe in this approach. We tend to maybe, give empiricism less attention for various reasons. I mean, we come from a lot of pre-modern traditions where there's a lot of critique of kind of modern science. But she was arguing that, actually, there's stuff to learn in data. You can use the tools of empiricism to study things, to know things, right? And so epistemically, right, there are many ways to get at something, to know truth. Of course, one of them is through philosophy and liberal arts, that kind of thing. And then, of course, there is modern empiricism. And so, in one of the paragraphs in the article, she begins by saying, but more in-depth, empirically grounded research will be necessary to help verify that the theory of classical character education translates effectively into practice and concrete outcomes. Okay, and so, again, my background is doing empirical work, and so, just a little plug for our department. One of the research projects in the Department of Ed Reform at the University of Arkansas is the Classical Education Research Lab. Okay, this is actually just launched recently. It's one that I direct. I've got the URL up there. And what we're interested in doing is coming alongside the classical school world to help make a case and study the effectiveness of classical schools. Okay, so what I'm about to present to you is one of the studies that I've done with my team as part of this lab. Okay, so first of all, I guess the topic is on poetry, and so let me maybe kind of just solicit, or actually let me present the questions we want to answer, and then I want to get your thoughts a little bit before I jump into what we did and what we found. Okay, so we want to try with the partnership of Sager Classical Academy, we wanted to study the effects of poetry. Okay, and we wanted to study the effects of poetry in particular, 4 outcomes. 4 outcomes are as follows. So attentiveness. Okay, so if students are are exposed to poetry, and by the way, I didn't mention this, this was in the confines of a science classroom. If students are exposed to poetry in conjunction with their science curriculum, do they, one, become more attentive to the topic that they're studying? Okay? And what we mean by attentiveness is not that they're just kind of sitting at their desk and then focused on the teacher, what we're doing. What we mean by attentiveness is, do they actually start to notice the things that they're studying as part of their everyday lives? Right? So the first graders, as part of this project, were studying birds. And so we want to know, hey, if we integrate poetry in this unit on birds, would the students all of a sudden seem to notice birds more around just in their daily lives? Okay? So does poetry enhance attentiveness towards a topic? The other thing we wanted to ask was, does poetry enhance affinity towards a topic? Right? Are the students drawn towards the topic that they're studying? So for first graders, by reading and engaging with poetry in conjunction with whatever they're doing in the science curriculum, do they become drawn to birds? Do they find birds beautiful? Do they love them, right? Are the affections kind of stirred for birds? Okay. Third, we want to know, does it make students more curious? All right, so if you've integrated poetry and now you've hopefully become more attentive to birds, are kind of drawn to birds a bit more, are you curious to learn more about that topic, whether it's birds or whatever the subject of the unit was? Okay. And then fourth, not quite related to the others, but we just want to also know, if students read poetry, does exposure to poetry make them enjoy poetry more? Okay, and I guess we hope that's the case. Certainly poetry is a large part of what we like to expose kids to. Okay, so I guess my question that I'd like to pose first is, why would we expect poetry to do any of this? And I'll just welcome any theories, thoughts, your prior beliefs. What is it about poetry, do you think, would even make a difference? Why should I even ask these questions? Why is this plausible?
It interacts with a different part of your brain, maybe?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You want to say more about that? Like what part?
Just more than knowledge acquisition, facts acquisition.
Yeah.
Different interaction.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Right. There is something that's evoked, right, through that medium.
It gives that left-right coordination, especially, typically the female will have that left-right connection already.
Yeah.
For the guys, that makes a lot of difference to kind of connect some feeling with the fact.
Yeah. So that's kind of like a brain science, cognitive science, even type explanation for some of. I'm sorry, it's rude. I should know your names, Christine. Just said. Other thoughts on what's the magic of poetry?
It does connect your emotions to words.
Yeah.
And bigger picture.
Right. There's an affective part to it, right? Yeah.
Creates memory. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. Cindy, yeah.
Our brains are just designed, they like that cadence, that repetition, that's why we learn songs so well in the grammar stage.
Yeah.
Because our brains just love that.
Yeah, there's something to the meter, right? The meter, the rhyme, right? My sister texted me a few months ago. She has a now 5-year-old, and she noticed with a 5-year-old that he's able to recite the books that she reads to them if the books are written in meter and rhyme, but not others. I thought that was really fascinating. Yeah.
Might be too much of a generalization, but you tend to have kids that are like, I love math and science, don't like literature. Or I love literature, but hate math and science.
Yeah.
And now you're kind of
Sure, right.
both sides of
Right.
the party.
Right. Right.
Kind of pulling some across the science world that may not typically think about literature and science.
Yeah. And we like to talk about like the coherence, right, of a classical curriculum, right? That we don't see the different disciplines as siloed or disparate and separated from each other, right? And so maybe there's something going on there, right? So so let me explain. I alluded to what we did to the kids. So let me explain what we actually did, okay? And then I'll show you some more specifics of what this might have looked like in implementation. So, Sacred Classical Academy, they've got multiple classes for grades K through 2. Okay, and so on the left column there, that's going to be to use scientific terms, our control group. Okay, I'm sorry, our treatment group. They're going to get poetry. So we have 2 kindergarten classrooms, a single first grade class, a single second grade class. Okay, and those are the students that are going to, for a 2-week science unit, have poetry integrated into that content. Okay, and then basically almost a mirror image on the other side, you've got a single kindergarten class, first grade class, and second grade class that'll just do essentially business as usual for that 2-week science unit. Okay, so we came in before we did anything. We surveyed all the students. I had a couple research assistants. We drove up from Fayetteville, Arkansas to Siloam Springs and sat with the students and interviewed them with some survey instruments. And then we just let the world spin, right? We let the Sacred teachers do what they were asked to do. That lasted about 2 weeks, and then we came back and resurveyed the students, okay, on measures of affinity, attentiveness, those outcomes that we're interested in. All right. So why were we expecting something? And I think a lot of you were probably all aiming the answers, I think, at why we think poetry would make a difference. And I think maybe it's only appropriate that we use poetry to explain why poetry would make a difference. So this is from A Midsummer Night's Dream, Act 5, so Theseus. So this is the part in the story where, Shakespearean comedy, you have conflicts between pairs of lovers, and somehow it all works out. And Theseus is like, how did this happen? And so he's remarking, here, I'll just read this for us here. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies, that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. Okay? And I want to direct your attention, especially to the second and third line, the idea that there's a way to apprehend what's real that simple, straightforward, cool reason can't. Okay, and I want to draw that out. And so if you think about this, what's the language of science typically? Right, the language of science is it's about precision of language, definitions. You kind of reason from one thing to the other. If you're going to try to define things, right, the words are carefully chosen and you don't embellish it, right? That kind of straightforward, formal, rational thinking is one way we have to kind of access reality and what's true. But there's also another way beyond just that, right? And I think poetry, as we were talking about meter and rhyme, activating different parts of the brain, that there's something that we engage in that's different when we go through the poetic medium, okay? And so we think, at least our kind of hypothesis, working hypothesis, is that, well, with poetry, for the first graders, if they were learning about birds, if students were reading poetry about birds alongside the regular scientific curriculum, maybe they're going to apprehend something about birds that straightforward, formal language can't quite get you. Okay, the latter part of the statement that Theseus makes here. A poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth and from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to every nothing a local habitation and a name, right? We emphasize language in classical education, right? Because that's kind of the means by which we access the world around us. And perhaps, again, poetry, because of the use of metaphor, the use of meter, imagery, evoking the emotions, maybe it helps us to latch on to the there that's there. Okay? And so this is kind of the working theory we have. So let me give you some examples of the poetry that we asked the teachers to do. So the kindergartners were studying the weather. Okay, and so one of the poems we curated this. Christina Rossetti, Who Has Seen the Wind? We should just enjoy this anyway, so I'll read it to you. Who has seen the wind? Neither I nor you. But when the leaves hang trembling, the wind is passing through. Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by. Okay? Right, I mean, you could talk about the wind in terms of models of meteorology and air pressure and like, oh, here's a high pressure system, low pressure system. I mean, again, these models aren't bad, right? They're all ways of kind of helping us access what's there. But there's something that's added here. You can almost, like when I read this, I kind of feel the wind itself when I read that. Any other reactions to this poem, by the way? Just kind of, we can have a little fun here and just kind of enjoy some poetry.
I like the switch of I nor you and you nor I.
Yeah.
To give you, more rhyming possibilities.
Yeah. Right? You're just playing with language, right?
Still consistency, still change.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
lot of imagery, because as I'm reading, but when the leaves hang trembling, I'm just imagining, like, the different kinds of trees and
Yeah.
how they
Yeah.
look in the wind.
Yeah.
A cedar tree versus an oak tree.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just, when I read that line, I always think I've got a couple oak trees in the neighborhood, and some of the leaves from the fall are all brown. They're hanging there. They actually survived the winter. I don't know how they did that, but the leaf is just still hanging there, right? And it just kind of calls to mind lots of things. And I don't know. I mean, can't verify this empirically, but I don't know how much I would have noticed that had I maybe not been familiar with this poem, right? The idea of a leaf just kind of hanging there as you're walking along. So let me just show you some of the examples of the poems for the other grades. So Bird Came Down the Walk by Emily Dickinson. This was one of the poems we asked the first grade teachers to cover. Again, let's just have some fun here. So a bird came down the walk he did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw. And then he drank a dew from a convenient grass, and then hopped sideways to the wall to let a beetle pass. He glanced with rapid eyes that hurried all abroad. They looked like frightened beads, I thought. He stirred his velvet head. Like one in danger, cautious, I offered him a crumb, and he unrolled his feathers and rowed him softer home. Then oars divide the ocean to silver for a seam, or butterflies off banks of noon leap plashless as they swim. Right. So, any reactions?
I think with both of these poems, it's funny because I hear conversations with my daughter. Just my daughter's in first grade, and
Yeah.
she even the other day was asking me, "Mommy, can I catch the wind? Mommy, can I feel the wind?" And even like birds, like talking about the birds, I'm like, I feel like children often think in poetry, even though they don't realize that they're thinking in poetry.
Yeah.
Which I think draws them to poetry.
Yeah.
In a classroom.
Yeah.
And they just both made me think of like just the way my daughter speaks.
Yeah. In fact, I think we're not even cognizant of how much we use metaphor in our own daily lives. I mean, I'm having trouble thinking of some on the spot, but even among academics, there are these like words that always come up in a talk. So people say, "Let me walk you through these results," right? Like, wait, what does it mean to walk you through a result? The results are, but so they say like, "Yeah, I'm going to just show you what we found," right? Or like, "Can you unpack that theory?" Well, I mean, you just kind of imagine like you're unpacking a suit, right? You're just drawing more things out, right? And so I'm sure you could think not too far, don't think too hard, and you probably find there's all these metaphors we actually use, and perhaps this is one way to kind of access that.
Your choice of poems also is a real good exposure
Mm-hmm.
And just the first two,
Yeah.
it's about everything, not just seeing, not
Yes.
just hearing.
Yes.
It's like you're showing the broader experience.
Yeah. 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 Right. Engaging. Right. Yeah. You're almost fully immersed, right, in what the experience of the bird is, or what a bird is.
Oh, this one
Yeah.
this one got my attention with the U factor, eating them wherever.
Yeah.
That's just like, that's right down little guy's alley.
Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Well, so second graders were learning about the phases of the moon. So we brought some moon poems. So this is Percy Shelley, To the Moon. And like a dying lady, lean and pale, who totters forth, wrapped in gauzy veil, out of her chamber, led by the insane and feeble wanderings of her fading brain, the moon arose up in the murky east, a white and shapeless mass. Art thou pale for weariness of climbing heaven and gazing on the earth, wandering companionless among the stars that have a different birth, and ever changing like a joyous eye that finds no object worth its constancy? Reactions?
I've heard this before.
Yeah.
And every time I hear it, I just like instantly feel bad for the moon.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it gives the moon a personality. Almost.
Yeah, yeah.
Makes me want to learn more about the moon.
Oh, it works. You see? No. Yeah. I mean, the idea of a lonely moon. So let me jump to what we found here. And so, first of all, just to give you an idea of how we measured things. So again, we surveyed all the students. These are just some sample questions from the scales we created to try to measure some of these things. So, because you got to generate data and analyze it, right? So, attentiveness. How often do you see the wind? So, actually, going back to can you see the wind? Just as an interesting aside. So, when we asked the kindergartners this question at the end after the unit, in the group that did not get poetry, I think only like 1 out of the close to 10. Yeah, 1 out of 8. Anyway, only 1 of the students in that class said you could see the wind. For the other ones, I think it was about 2/3 of students said you could see the wind. Okay, so anyway, I just thought this was kind of an interesting finding, right? The way poetry can kind of open up possibilities, right? Kind of re-enchant the world even. So, what are these some other questions? Attentive. When I see a bird, I notice its color. Right? How often do you do that? I notice the moon in the sky at night. We also asked, do you notice the moon in the day? Right? See if we could find differences there. Affinity, again, that's just a measure of are you drawn to that object? Do you find it beautiful? Do you find it lovely? How much do you like talking about the weather for kindergartners? We asked the first graders if they wanted to have a bird for a pet. I don't know, that's just one of the ideas we had to try to measure their affinity towards birds. The moon's light is beautiful. And so, there's a series of questions. These are just samples. Same thing with curiosity. How much do you want to learn more about the rain? How much do you want to learn more about the names of more kinds of birds? How much do you want to learn more about the planets? So, in learning about the moon, maybe there's a broader interest in space that's generated there. And then lastly, of course, we just want to know if exposure to poetry actually made them like poetry more. Okay, and so we asked, do you like listening to poems? Do you like memorizing poems? Do you like reading poems? Okay, so I wonder if this is like the slide for the drum roll. Yes, it is. Okay, so we collected the data. We created scores for each of the 4 measures. Okay, and so I will walk you through the results. So 4 outcomes, a pair of bars for each outcome. The orange-ish color there represents the scores on each of those measures, the 4 measures for the students that didn't get poetry. And then the green bar represents the scores for the students who did have poetry integrated into their 2-week curriculum. Okay, so what do we find? Well, first of all, I mean, if you just kind of look at it and just not worry about all the statistical significance type stuff, it's nice to see the green bars are higher in each of the cases. Okay, so it looks like we're scoring the students that got poetry integrated into their science unit are scoring higher on attentiveness, affinity, curiosity, enjoyment. So they start to notice the moon or birds or the things about the weather more. They were drawn to those things. They found it beautiful. They found it lovely. More curious to learn. And certainly we're more likely to enjoy poetry. Okay. Now, of course, there's a reason. We follow scientific methods, right? It's to discipline us from overstating things. Okay. So if we want to impose some of the practices of the trade, really, what I'm kind of comfortable saying, if you put on the empiricist hat, is we saw changes in attentiveness and the enjoyment of poetry. Okay, affinity and curiosity, we didn't see quite much movement. I mean, as you can see, the differences between the 2 groups of students are pretty small. So scientifically, we can't rule out that the differences are attributable to random chance rather than an actual change in those outcomes. But for attentiveness, do notice the topic of study more, and certainly enjoyment of poetry. Those are not only kind of sizable gains there along on these scales, but certainly they cross the threshold of statistical significance. And so, with this, here we have evidence of poetry's, the kind of magic of poetry to increase attentiveness. And it's great to see that the students also enjoy poetry when they're exposed to poetry. Again, with affinity and curiosity, I mean, we can get into a broader discussion here of what we think is going on. And I had a conversation with Jim. Why didn't we see things in curiosity? And Jim kind of volunteered an explanation. At that young age, kindergarten through 3rd grade, the threshold for curiosity was already probably pretty high. And maybe poetry itself wouldn't be able to generate much movement and much change there. And that said, I mean, certainly one could ask, well, if we did this kind of intervention at perhaps the middle school or upper school grades where, it stops being cool to go to school, so to speak, right, might we see differences? I don't know, these are all questions that we can probably explore in the future. And then same thing for affinity. Again, you see a sizable difference, higher levels there for students in the class that had poetry. But again, can't quite rule out that that's driven by other things. In fact, we're glad we took baseline measures before implementing the poetry intervention. It turns out that the students in the classes that were going to get poetry already started a little bit ahead on affinity. And so it looks like they both equally moved up. And so you can't quite say that, hey, it's the poetry that increased the affinity. One class was already higher than the other. But if you can account for all those baseline measures and other things with attentiveness and enjoyment of poetry, with kind of pretty much pretty good confidence using kind of scientific standards, see the effects of poetry here. So anyway, we can kind of launch into a bigger discussion. I welcome questions. But I'll leave it to you as you kind of go back to your schools and your respective places to consider, the pedagogical power of poetry. What might that look like? What might it look like to integrate that across the curriculum in other ways, right? To bring that about. And a not quite so shameless plug. I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of, but with the Classical Education Research Lab that we're starting at the University of Arkansas, right? The end goal is to answer kind of this call to bring in more evidence, empirical evidence to bear. Again, not that there's something inherently better about empirical evidence. But we do want to do research to inform the practice of teaching and learning. Perhaps doing research might inform the way we do our pedagogy, do our leadership. And then B, also as a way to make the case for the classical approach. Right? Less subject to, we kind of believe with good reason, I think, theoretically and philosophically of the power of classical ed. Imagine bringing more of an evidence base to parents to say, hey, look, this is what we do. And we can show it here as well through these other means. And so, anyway, that's all I have. But I do want to just open it up for questions and discussions, just reactions and broader discussion about the integrating poetry and research.
If I could give you a little background on something too in this that we found out afterwards, which was interesting and kind of helped to back up what we found out, was those classes that didn't get to do the poetry, they felt cheated.
Poor Mrs. Metcalf here.
My second graders, because I was the control class, so my students didn't get poetry, and they knew their friends were getting poetry. And so, but it was also an interesting, because then they were like, well, can we read the poetry now? After and they wanted to read it Deary, and I was like, nope. We're just doing the moon, just doing the moon. But then we went back and read some of the poems in the books because they were like, we want the poetry, which I thought was also a great
that's such a fascinating, And it's like I always cringe when I do these design these studies. It's like I have to hold off on if I'm doing an intervention where I think there's something good. Sorry, there's a group that I have to please wait so you can see that this works. Yeah.
As far as finding resources, Google search or are there other really good
for the poetry? Yeah. So this was certainly a team effort. It wasn't just me. So Carrie Eben, who's also here, is on the board at Sager, and so she helped. Jessica Hooten Wilson, right, is also on the board, and so she helped. We helped to curate some of these things, and so it's one of these things you can only kind of take your students as far as you've gone, and so to cultivate a brain trust to be able to curate, what are the great pieces out there that would that we want to expose kids to, we kind of work through that. Yeah.
You gave a great number of resources in your last class. Could we share it?
Oh yeah, I know. Wait, what? Yeah, I missed.
Poetry workshop this morning, but the number one website is Ambleside Online, the Charlotte Mason method. The Ambleside Online has made public for free poetry for every day of every month for kindergarten through grade 12, and they have everything linked and cross-referenced if you want to search by subject to math and science.
Wow.
It's an incredible resource. So Ambleside is all one word, Ambleside Online. If you Google it, you'll find it. And poetry or poetry groups, I forget how they have it labeled. So they do it by grade and by month, everything.
Wow. It's amble, like walking, ambling?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Ambleside?
Yes. Online. Yeah, online. All one word.
.com, I guess, or yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So do you have plans to do this in a junior high classroom? 'Cause
Wait.
that would be, we're junior high teachers, clearly we didn't read.
The more the merrier, yes. We'd love to study. Certainly from a kind of empirical research standpoint, that'll let us do a lot more.
The school that we teach at,
Yeah.
we're all high school teachers, and we're just looking for math and science stuff. That's why we're
Yeah.
here. But our elementary, I would say I have 3 kids
Yeah.
2 of them are still in the grammar school. One is in 7th grade, so she's gone K through 6
Yeah.
in our school. And our school over the years has really incorporated poetry into the grammar school very well, and is working, like our omnibus students and rhetoric students write and recite and learn poetry. And even in our convocation, poetry is part of it. Somebody reads a poem, and then we pray and we sing, and the poetry has been over the last few years integrated into our school.
Yeah.
But it's certainly not integrated into my junior high math class. And so.
Yeah. No.
And I don't even have a vision on how that would go, other than with lots of snickering and this woman is crazy, because we know how 13-year-olds.
Right.
And not that I wouldn't want to, but like I also wouldn't want it to be some distraction where they can't get over what just hit them. And they can't learn a factor.
Yeah.
Because-
Yeah.
So do you have thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
no, I mean, I'd love to, to think about, I mean, I'm a former math teacher myself, and
Or
I-
you integrate it separately, like if, I would think science would be, so he's teaching chemistry and you're teaching life science, or I don't know, whatever you're teaching.
Yeah.
Like then you would task those comp, rhetoric, omnibus
Mhm.
to incorporate principles from his science classroom into the rhetoric or comp at the same time. So they were parallel.
Yeah.
So he's not reciting poetry at the beginning of the
Uh-huh.
lesson, which wouldn't be the worst thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the, I mean, the unfortunate thing is like being, in academia, I'm so, I have to like work to not be disconnected from what's going on in the classroom. And I say that because I think, I think from my position, all I can say is like, look, I mean, we can do stuff, but I think, just to encourage you to use that imagination, right, and figure out what can we do with poetry. I mean, I think it's more than just integrating in a unit too. I mean, you're talking about even trying to. I guess you have this track with rhetoric and science, and it's lined up. But where else?
Would that be?
Yeah, where else could you integrate it? Yeah, I don't know, and so, but I think the sky's the limit here. I mean, of course within reason and wisdom, but yeah, to consider and imagine, yeah, what how could we even pursue excellence better with our pedagogy? What are some creative ways to bring that about? I mean, I totally missed Christine's seminar this morning. I was so interested, but or I don't know. I mean, do you have thoughts on that?
No, I do know if we hunt, there's a poem for every subject you can think of. They really are out there.
I just went to the site and I found one that I could use coming up here next month.
I still have handouts from this morning if you just want
Yeah.
sources and websites and pass them down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or the other way.
Yeah. And I at the Classical Education Research Lab, yeah, we'd love to create these kinds of research practice partnerships, if you will, to come alongside and help think through some of these things, but also to bake in kind of some research to again accomplish those two goals, right? Show in another way, powers of the power of different aspects of the classical approach, but also to kind of hold a mirror up to ourselves, right? I mean, we shouldn't be afraid to reflect on our own practice, and if something's not working, to kind of admit that, right? To have the humility to say, like, okay, you know what, maybe I overstated what I believed about something, and what would it look like to kind of course correct, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's all part of the pursuit of excellence. I think to not be afraid of admitting mistakes, but then also to think creatively, right? What might this look like in our teaching and learning?
How do the Charlotte Mason schools do it? I mean,
Yeah, it does.
Like the poems were already incorporated in their nature studies outside. dictations and memorizations all outside whatever subject they were covering. So it's, I mean, it's a similar principle.
Yeah.
That I know. I haven't read all 6 volumes of the Shirley Mason everything. So
Yeah.
the rest of volumes.
The word.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have friends in Denver, and their kids go to an Ambleside school, and yeah, we were talking in the car on the way down how we were talking about inside recess during snow days, but one of Charlotte Mason's things is you go outside every day, and this is Denver, like those kids go outside every day, like it's not the weather, it's your clothes, and you bring the right clothes because you're going outside. And I kind of like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Other questions, comments, thoughts, tips that you'd like to, wisdom you'd like to share with all your colleagues? Well, anyway, I'm happy. Oh,
I had a question.
yeah.
Why did you guys decide to start with such a young age group instead of? Because you said their peak of curiosity was already a lot.
Sure, maybe, right? Yeah.
In like high school, so. Speaking from like the perspective of a high schooler.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you start with the high schoolers who are maybe less interested in subjects?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. One of the practical things about pulling off research is you got to work with the configurations you have. And so Sager had multiple classes at those early grades, but someday, a lot of classes at the upper grades. And so, yeah, it was mostly, it's purely a practical thing that we had to work with what we had, sample-wise.
Coming from the perspective of a student, I could see how like poetry, like in our natural philosophy class, sometimes there's like one poem or like one or two.
Yeah.
But I always am more interested in that topic.
Yeah.
Because of that poem.
Huh.
Because I always think back to that poem.
Yeah.
And I go, oh, that's good.
Yeah.
So that plays in.
Yeah. No, there's some wisdom there. Yeah. Well, anyway, we're open to doing all sorts of. I've got a couple other projects underway. Just to kind of maybe spark your thinking a bit. Over Advent, I did a study with the college students at the U of A, or University of Arkansas, and we created 3 groups. They all got a free book, and one of them was an Advent devotional in poetry. The other was in just a regular Advent devotional in prose. And then we just gave them a random Christian book. This was with the campus ministries. And we're still kind of crunching the numbers through there, but we were asking some questions about, does poetry enhance your engagement with the liturgical calendar or the holidays? And right now we're we're going to have to redo this a couple times just to boost the sample, but it does look like on these measures of did the students find Christmas meaningful, or did they enjoy the Christmas season? We're seeing some difference with some engagement there. Although these are unofficial results, so we gotta work at things. But again, right? It's to kind of think through, kind of creatively, like, well, where can we bring in some of these elements, and for a pedagogical purpose. So, all right. Any last questions, comments? Yeah. Oh, the former math teacher taught public high school math teacher and got, long story short, after going back to grad school, realized how boring school actually is, and then stumbled, most schools are, and then stumbled upon like classical thought and modernity and all these things. I'm like, wow, there's a whole world out there. And so, and also, my wife's not here to hear this, but she's an English lit background. She had some role to play as well. So, anyway, that's the shorter answer. There you go. So. Anyway, thanks for your time. I'll be here. I've got cards if you'd like one. But yeah, thanks for coming. Enjoy the discussion, and happy to explore partnerships if you'd like as well. So thanks.